The rain did not arrive all at once. It came the way most profound things do, slowly, thoughtfully, as though the sky itself were considering whether the earth below was worthy of such a gift. It began as a whisper against the windows of the small bookshop on Rue de Ville, a gentle tapping so delicate that at first Alara thought it might be the fingers of a ghost trying to gain entry. She paused in her task. She had been reorganizing the poetry section, a ritual she performed every Thursday evening without fail, and tilted her head toward the sound. There it was again, a soft percussion against glass, irregular and intimate, like a confession being spoken in fragments. She set down the leather-bound copy of Baudelaire she had been holding and walked to the front window of the shop. The street outside, usually alive with the warm amber glow of street lamps, and the evening bustle of townspeople returning home from their dinners, had transformed into something else entirely. The cobblestones gleamed like the scales of some ancient serpent, wet and dark and alive with reflected light. The rain was falling in earnest now, not in the violent, dramatic sheets that summer storms brought, but in a slow, deliberate curtain that seemed to soften the edges of everything it touched. The harsh lines of buildings became gentle. The sharp shadows of doorways became welcoming caves. Even the old wrought iron bench across the street, the one where the homeless man named Jacques slept most nights, the one Alara always looked at with a quiet ache in her chest. Even that bench seemed, in the rain, to possess a kind of dignity it lacked in the dry light of day. Alara pressed her palm flat against the cool glass. She could feel the vibration of each raindrop through the window, a tiny tremor that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest, in that place where she kept all the things she could not name. She loved the rain. She had always loved the rain. As a child, she had been the sort of girl who would sneak out of her bedroom window during thunderstorms just to stand in the garden with her arms spread wide, her face turned upward, her mouth open to catch the sky's tears on her tongue. Her mother had been horrified by this behavior, naturally. "You'll catch your death," she would say, pulling Alara back inside and wrapping her in towels that smelled of lavender and soap. But even her mother's worry could not dim the feeling that the rain gave her. That sense of being connected to something vast and unknowable. Something that existed beyond the boundaries of her small life in her small town. Her mother was gone now. 7 years gone, and the rain still felt like a conversation with someone who understood her completely. Alara breathed against the window, and her breath bloomed across the glass like a small white flower, then faded. She watched it disappear and thought about how everything disappeared eventually. Breath on glass, people from your life, the afternoon light from a room. But the rain always came back. That was the thing about rain. It was the world's way of remembering what it had lost and trying, however futilely, to get it back. A crack of thunder, distant and low, rolled across the sky like the purr of some enormous cat. Alara smiled. She returned to her books, but her mind was no longer on poetry. It was on the rain, and on the way the rain made her want to tell stories. This was another thing about the rain. It turned her into a storyteller. Not the kind of storyteller who stood before crowds in brightly lit halls, commanding attention with gestures and voice modulation, but the quieter kind. The kind who told stories to herself or to the empty rooms of a bookshop, or to the rain itself, as though the rain were a listener who would never interrupt, never judge, never grow bored. The rain asked nothing of her except that she speak. And so she did. She had been telling herself stories for as long as she could remember. stories about the people who came into her bookshop. The elderly widow who bought romance novels and always smelled like rose water. The young medical student who purchased thick textbooks on anatomy, but whose eyes always drifted toward the shelf of fairy tales when he thought no one was looking. The middle-aged man in the too-tight suit who came in every Monday to buy a copy of the newspaper and never once looked at the books, but always lingered, as though simply being surrounded by words was enough to sustain him for another week. She wove narratives around all of them, giving them histories and futures and inner lives that may or may not have been accurate, but that felt, in the moment of their telling, undeniably true. But there was one story she had never been able to tell. One story that lived inside her like a stone in a river, smooth and heavy and permanent, worn down by years of water, but never dissolved. It was the story of the night her father had disappeared, and it was the story she carried like a second skeleton beneath her skin, invisible but structural, defining the shape of everything she was. Her father, Marcel Larach, had been a storyteller too. Not a writer, not a performer, but a teller of stories in the oldest sense. A man who sat in chairs and spoke words into the air and made the air come alive. He had been a clockmaker by trade, a profession that seemed, on its surface, to have nothing to do with storytelling, but that, in Alara's understanding, was fundamentally the same thing. Both required an understanding of mechanisms, the way one thing led to another, the way a small movement could set a larger one in motion, the way time itself was nothing but a story that the universe told itself over and over again. Marcel had disappeared on a rainy night 11 years ago. He had gone out to deliver a clock, a special commission, he had said, for a client who lived far outside of town, in a place where the roads were bad and the street lamps did not reach. He had on the forehead, told her he would be back by morning, and walked out into the rain. She had been 16 years old. She had watched him go from this very window, the same window she was standing at now, and she had noticed, even then, that he did not take an umbrella. He had not come back by morning. He had not come back by the next morning, or the next, or the next. The police had searched, of course. They had followed the road he was said to have taken, the old forest road that wound through the Bois de Sombre like a vein through a body, and they had found nothing. No sign of an accident, no sign of a struggle, no sign of Marcel Larach at all, except for his truck, which was discovered 3 days later at the edge of the forest, parked neatly by the side of the road, as though he had simply stepped out of it and walked into the trees of his own volition. The truck had been empty. The clock he was delivering, a magnificent thing, Alara knew, because she had watched him build it over the course of 3 months. Its brass gears polished to a warm glow, its face painted with tiny roses that he had added at the last moment because, he said, everything deserves to be beautiful. The clock was gone. Someone had taken the clock, or her father had delivered it, or something else entirely had happened, something that the rational daylight world had no framework for understanding. The case had gone cold within a month. The detective assigned to it, a tired-looking man named Gerard, who smelled of cigarettes and regret, had sat Alara and her mother down in their small kitchen and told them, with the practiced gentleness of someone who has delivered bad news many times before, that people sometimes disappeared, that it was sad but not unusual, that the forest was deep and the weather had been bad, and sometimes, when the rain fell hard enough, it washed away the evidence of everything. Alara had not believed him then, and she did not believe him now. Her father had not been washed away. Her father had gone somewhere specific to deliver a specific thing to a specific person, and that person, that place, had kept him. She did not know where. She did not know who. But she knew, with the same unshakable certainty that she knew her own name, that the story was not over, that there was more to be told. And so she told it, not to anyone else. Her mother had not wanted to hear it, had in fact forbidden Alara from speaking about it, as though the words themselves might summon something terrible. But to herself, in the quiet hours of the night, in the bed that was too big for one person, but that she could not bring herself to replace, she told the story of her father's disappearance over and over again, each time adding new details, new possibilities, new threads of narrative that wove the known and the unknown into a fabric that was, if not exactly true, then at least beautiful. The rain outside intensified. It drummed against the roof of the bookshop with a deeper resonance now, and Alara could hear the gutters beginning to overflow, sending small waterfalls cascading down the sides of the building. She should close up, she thought. She should lock the door, turn off the lights, and walk the 3 blocks to her apartment, where she would make a cup of chamomile tea and read a few pages of whatever book she had left on her nightstand, and eventually, fitfully, fall asleep. But she did not move. Something was holding her in place. Not physically. There was nothing restraining her. No force keeping her feet planted on the worn wooden floor. It was something else, something subtler, like the feeling of being watched by someone who was not looking at you directly, but was aware of you in some peripheral, intuitive way. She felt it in the back of her neck, that prickle of attention that all animals recognize, and most humans have learned to ignore. She turned slowly from the window and looked at the door of her bookshop. It was closed. It was always closed at this hour. She had locked it an hour ago, turned the small brass sign from ouvert to fermé, drawn the heavy burgundy curtains that her mother had sewn years ago. and that still smelled faintly of the lavender that had been her signature scent. The door was closed. The shop was empty, and Alara was alone. And yet, she stood very still and listened. The rain was loud, but beneath it, like a melody beneath an orchestration, she could hear something else. A sound that was not quite a knock and not quite a footstep, but something in between, a presence, a weight, a displacement of air that suggested that someone or something was standing just on the other side of the door. Her heart began to beat in that particular rhythm that fear produces, not the steady drum of calm, but the irregular, syncopated pulse of a body preparing to run. But Alara did not run. She had not run from the story of her father, and she would not run from whatever this was. She stood her ground as she had been standing her ground for 11 years, and she waited. The knock, when it came, was so soft that she almost missed it. 3 taps, barely louder than the rain, spaced with a precision that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Tap, tap, tap. The kind of knock that does not demand entry, but requests it, humbly and without presumption. Alara walked to the door. She could see nothing through the curtained glass. The burgundy fabric obscured everything, reducing the world outside to vague shapes and shadows. She placed her hand on the lock. She should not open it. Every rational impulse, every survival instinct honed by years of living alone in a town where people did not always have good intentions, told her to keep the door closed. It was late. It was raining. She was alone. These were the conditions under which bad things happened, and she knew this, and yet she opened the door. The figure standing on her doorstep was not what she had expected. Then again, she was not sure what she had expected. A stranger seeking shelter, perhaps. A drunk who had lost his way. A child, even running from something unseen. These were the possibilities her rational mind had constructed, and each of them would have been explicable, containable, manageable within the framework of ordinary experience. The figure on her doorstep was none of these things. It was tall, impossibly tall, or at least taller than anyone she had ever seen. 7 feet if it was an inch, wrapped in a dark cloak that seemed to drink the rain rather than repel it. The fabric of the cloak was unlike anything Alara could identify. It shifted in color as the water moved across it, now black, now deep green, now the dark blue of a night sky just before the stars appeared. Beneath the cloak, she could see the suggestion of a body, broad shoulders, long arms, a torso that narrowed at the waist. But the details were obscured, hidden by layers of wet fabric that clung and draped and moved with a life of their own. But it was the face, or rather, what she could see of the face, that stopped her breath. The figure wore a mask. Not a simple mask, not the kind worn at carnivals or masquerades, but something far more intricate and far more ancient. It was made of what appeared to be dark metal, iron, perhaps, or something older, something that had been forged in a time when the world was younger and stranger, and it covered the entire face from hairline to jaw. The metal had been worked into an expression that was impossible to read. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between, with deep-set eye holes that revealed nothing of what lay behind them, and a mouth that was set in a line that could have been a frown or a smile or neither. The surface of the mask was etched with patterns that seemed, in the shifting light of the street lamp, to move vines and thorns and flowers that grew and wilted and grew again in an endless cycle, as though the mask itself were telling a story that could not be heard, but only seen. The figure stood perfectly still. Rain poured over it, over the cloak and the mask, and the boots that Alara now noticed, heavy, dark, laced with intricate patterns that matched the etchings on the mask. And yet it did not shiver, did not hunch against the cold, did not display any of the small involuntary movements that a body makes when it is wet and cold and standing in a rainstorm. It stood as though the rain were not there at all, or as though it had long ago ceased to matter. Alara realized that she had been staring for several seconds without speaking. She gathered herself, drew a breath that tasted of rain and cold air and something else, something faintly metallic and ancient, and said, "Yes." The figure did not answer immediately. It raised one hand, a gloved hand she saw, covered in the same dark fabric as the cloak, and held it out to her. In the hand was an object, and when Alara saw what it was, the world tilted beneath her feet like a ship in a storm. It was a key, a brass key, old and small and warm despite the rain, with a bow shaped like a rose. She knew this key. She had seen it before, not in person, but in a drawing, a sketch her father had made on a piece of parchment and left tucked inside the cover of a book of fairy tales of all things, a battered copy of the stories she had loved as a child, the ones about beauty and beasts and enchanted castles and roses that bloomed in winter. She had found the sketch years after his disappearance, while going through his remaining belongings, and she had studied it so many times that she could have drawn it from memory. The rose-shaped bow, the elongated shaft, the 3 peculiar teeth at the end that looked less like they were designed to fit a lock, and more like they were designed to fit a spell. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. The figure lowered its hand, but did not withdraw the key. The mask tilted slightly, as though considering her question, and then from behind the metal, a voice emerged. It was a strange voice, deep and resonant, yes, but also layered, as though more than one person were speaking at the same time, or as though the voice were being filtered through something vast and hollow, like a cathedral or a cave. It was a voice that sounded like it had not been used in a very long time, and the words came slowly, carefully, like someone relearning the mechanics of speech. Your father, the voice said, asked me to give it to you. The rain fell between them like a veil. Alara felt the key's warmth reach her even from a distance, a gentle pulsing that matched the rhythm of her own heartbeat, or perhaps set a new one. She looked from the key to the mask to the cloak and back to the key again, and she felt the stone in her chest, the story she had been carrying for 11 years, begin to shift, begin to crack, begin to show the first hairline fractures through which something new might eventually grow. My father, she repeated. My father has been gone for 11 years. Oh yes, the figure said. And you expect me to believe that he sent you. I expect nothing, the figure said. I was asked to deliver. I have delivered. What you do with what has been delivered is not my concern. The formality of the language struck her. It was not the language of this town, not the casual French of the streets and markets and bookshops. It was older, more structured, more precise. The kind of language used in legal documents from centuries past, or in the transcripts of trials that had taken place in times when the boundary between the human world and the world of the extraordinary was thinner and more permeable than it was now. Who are you? She asked. The figure was silent for a long moment. The rain filled the silence, and in that filling, Alara became aware of how quiet the street had become. The usual sounds of the town, the distant hum of traffic, the bark of a dog, the clatter of dishes from the restaurant 2 doors down, had all faded, as though the rain had drawn a circle around the bookshop, and everything outside that circle had simply ceased to exist. "I am the one who keeps the house," the figure said finally. "The house where your father's clock now sits. The house where your father stayed for a time. The house to which this key belongs. And where is this house?" The figure raised its other hand, the one not holding the key, and pointed past Alara, past the bookshop, past the town, toward the dark mass of the Bois de Sombre that rose on the horizon like a wave frozen mid-crash. The forest. Of course it was the forest. It had always been the forest. The road is not on any map, the figure said. But the key will find it if you let it. Hold the key in your hand and walk into the rain, and it will lead you where you need to go. Alara stared at the forest. She had not been into the Bois de Sombre since the night her father disappeared. No one in town went into the Bois de Sombre, not willingly. The forest had a reputation that predated the town itself. Stories passed down through generations of travelers who entered and did not return, of lights that moved between the trees on nights when there was no moon, of a sound like music that could be heard from the forest's edge, but that dissolved into silence the moment one stepped beneath the canopy. The forest was old, older than the roads around it, older than the fields that had been cleared to make room for those roads, older perhaps than the very concept of roads, and it carried its age with a kind of malevolent pride, as though it resented every attempt the human world had made to tame or circumvent it. "You're asking me to walk into that forest," Alara said. "In the rain, in the middle of the night, with a key that may or may not be what you say it is, given to me by someone, something that I have no reason to trust." "Oh, yes," the figure said. "Why should I?" The mask tilted again. That unreadable expression, those moving etchings of thorns and flowers. And then, from behind the metal, a sound that Alara did not expect, a sigh, low and long, and weighted with something that sounded achingly like sorrow. Because you have been telling yourself a story for 11 years, the figure said, and you know, you have always known that the story is incomplete, that there is a chapter missing, that there is a room in the house of your grief that you have never entered because you do not have the key. A pause. The rain intensified, as though the sky were leaning closer to hear what came next. Now you have the key. Alara felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water, each one sending out ripples that disturbed the surface of everything she thought she knew. She looked at the key again. The rose-shaped bow. The warmth that seemed to come not from the brass itself, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside the metal, as though the key contained a small, stubborn fire that refused to be extinguished by rain or time or grief. She thought of her father, his hands, calloused from years of working with tiny gears and springs, his voice, low and patient, telling her bedtime stories that he made up on the spot, stories about clockwork birds that sang real songs and mechanical horses that could run faster than the wind, and a garden made entirely of gears where the flowers bloomed in time with the ticking of a great invisible clock. She thought of the last story he had ever told her, the night before he disappeared. A story about a rain that fell not from the sky, but from the ground, rising upward like a reverse waterfall, and how the people who stood in that rain found that it washed away not dirt, but sadness, not grime, but grief, leaving them clean and new and unburdened in a way that no ordinary rain could achieve. She had thought at the time that it was just a story. She had been 16, and she had still believed that stories were just stories, that the boundary between the told and the real was absolute and impermeable. She had lost that belief in the years since, not all at once, but gradually, the way a shoreline erodes, each tide taking a little more, until the shape of the land is fundamentally altered. So she reached out and took the key. The warmth was immediate and enveloping, spreading from her palm up through her wrist and into her arm and across her chest and down through her legs and into the soles of her feet until her entire body felt as though it were being held by something gentle and immense. The key pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then settled into a steady glow that was not visible to the eye, but was undeniably present. A warmth that felt like reassurance, like a hand on her shoulder, like her father's voice saying, "It's all right, little one. I'm here. I've always been here." The figure lowered its empty hand. It seemed to shimmer slightly, as though the rain were passing through it rather than around it. And Alara realized with a start that the figure's edges were becoming less defined, its outline blurring at the boundaries, as though it were a drawing that was being erased from the outside in. "The key will guide you," the figure said, and its voice was fainter now, more distant, as though it were speaking from the far end of a very long corridor. "Do not be afraid of what you find. Do not be afraid of what you feel. The story has been waiting for you. It has always been waiting for you." The figure dissolved, not dramatically, not with a flash of light or a clap of thunder, but simply and quietly, like a word forgotten mid-sentence, like a note that fades from a piano string after the key has been released. One moment it was there, a towering presence on her doorstep, and the next it was not, and the space where it had stood was filled only with rain and the faint scent of something that might have been roses and might have been iron and might have been neither. Alara stood in the doorway of her bookshop, the key warm in her hand, the rain falling around her like a curtain between the world she knew and the world she did not. She looked at the forest. she looked back at the bookshop, at the warm light inside, at the familiar shelves of books, at the chair where she sat every evening to read, at the life she had built in the absence of her father, a life that was small and quiet and safe, and that, she now understood, had been a kind of hiding place, a story she had told herself to avoid the story she was meant to tell. She stepped out into the rain. She did not take a coat. She did not take an umbrella. She did not take her phone or her wallet or any of the objects that the modern world told her were necessary for survival. She took only the key and herself and the story that was beginning to unfold inside her like a map, and she walked. The key led her. She did not understand how. There was no arrow, no compass, no visible mechanism of guidance, but she felt it, a gentle pulling in her palm that directed her steps with a certainty that bypassed her rational mind entirely. Left at the end of Rue de Ville, right at the old stone bridge, past the bakery, which was dark and silent, its usual smell of fresh bread replaced by the clean, wet smell of rain, past the church, its steeple rising into the clouds like a finger pointing at something unseen. And then, at the edge of town, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt road, and the street lamps gave way to darkness, and the sounds of civilization gave way to the sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind through leaves, the creak of branches, the distant, rhythmic patter of rain against foliage. The key pulled her off the road entirely and toward the tree line. The Bois de Sambre loomed before her. Up close, it was even more intimidating than it appeared from a distance. The trees were enormous, ancient things with trunks as wide as carriages and bark, that was dark and deeply furrowed, like the face of a very old man who had seen too much and forgot how to smile. Their branches intertwined overhead in a canopy so dense that even in the daytime, Alara knew very little light would reach the forest floor. At night, in the rain, the forest was essentially a void, a darkness so complete that stepping into it felt like stepping out of the world entirely. The key pulsed in her hand, a question or perhaps an answer. Alara took a breath, deep, steadying, the kind of breath her father used to take before beginning a difficult repair on a delicate clock. And she stepped into the trees. The rain changed the moment she crossed the threshold. Outside the forest, it had been horizontal, driven by the wind, typical of an autumn storm. Inside, it fell straight down, vertically, with a precision that felt intentional, as though the canopy were directing the water, channeling it through gaps in the leaves to create specific patterns of rainfall on the ground below. The effect was of walking through a cathedral with a broken roof. Patches of dry ground alternating with columns of falling water, each one a kind of doorway that led not to another place, but to another feeling. Alara walked. The key pulled her forward, and she followed, and the forest moved around her like a living thing. She could feel it watching her, not with malice exactly, but with a wary curiosity, the way a cat watches a stranger enter its territory. The trees seemed to lean inward as she passed, their branches reaching toward her like arms, their leaves brushing against her hair and her shoulders with a touch that was startlingly gentle. The ground beneath her feet was soft, a carpet of decaying leaves and moss that absorbed her footsteps and returned no sound, so that she moved through the forest in perfect silence, a ghost in a ghost world. She walked for what felt like a very long time. Time in the forest was unreliable. It stretched and compressed in ways that had nothing to do with the ticking of a clock, bending around the trees and the rain and the darkness like light bending around a star. She might have been walking for minutes or hours or days. She could not have said. The key kept her anchored, its warmth a constant in the shifting unreality, a thread she could hold on to when the fabric of the world around her threatened to unravel. And then, without warning, the trees parted. She emerged into a clearing. The canopy opened above her, and for the first time since entering the forest, she could see the sky, not the dark, cloud-covered sky of the storm, but a different sky, clearer and deeper, scattered with stars that seemed closer than stars had any right to be, as though the forest had transported her not to another place on earth, but to another place entirely, a place where the distance between the ground and the heavens was measured not in miles, but in memories. And in the center of the clearing, illuminated by a light that appeared to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, was the house. It was not what she had expected. When the figure had said house, she had imagined something modest, a cottage perhaps, or a farmhouse, something that could exist in a forest without seeming incongruous. This was not a cottage. This was not a farmhouse. This was a shade, a vast, sprawling, impossible structure of dark stone and dark wood and dark glass that rose from the clearing like a dream that had decided, for reasons of its own, to become real. It had towers, 3 of them, each one a different height, each one crowned with a spire that pierced the star-scattered sky like a needle, stitching the earth to the heavens. It had windows, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one glowing with a faint amber light that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the ticking of a clock. It had a door, a massive thing of dark wood and iron, carved with the same patterns of thorns and flowers that she had seen on the figure's mask. And above the door, carved into the stone lintel in letters that were old and ornate, and that seemed to glow with their own inner light, were the words CEQUIAST PARDU Sera Trouve. What is lost will be found. Alara stood at the edge of the clearing, and stared at the shadow, and the shadow stared back at her, and between them the rain fell like a bridge of silver thread, connecting the woman who had spent 11 years telling an incomplete story to the place where the missing chapter had been waiting all along. She crossed the clearing. The rain was lighter here, almost gentle, falling in a fine mist that clung to her skin like gossamer. The ground was covered in flowers, not the small, hardy wildflowers that one might expect to find in a forest clearing, but full, lush, impossible blooms of every color and variety. Roses and lilies, and jasmine and orchids, and flowers she did not recognize. Flowers that seemed to have been bred in a world where the laws of botany were more like suggestions than rules. They were wet with rain, and the rain on their petals caught the amber light of the windows and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced at the edges of Alara's vision like fireflies. As she reached the door, the carvings were even more intricate up close. Thorns that seemed to actually pierce the stone, drawing tiny beads of something dark that might have been sap or might have been blood. Flowers that bloomed in 3 dimensions, their petals extending outward from the door's surface, as though trying to escape the wood that held them. And at the very center of the carving, at a height that corresponded roughly to where a person's heart would be, a single rose, fully open, its petals the deep red of a sunset, its center the gold of a clock's face. Alara raised the key. Her hand was trembling. She could see the fine vibration in her fingers, could feel the tremor running through her arm like an electrical current. But the key itself was steady, its warmth unwavering, its glow, and it was glowing now. She could see it, a soft golden light that matched the light of the windows, constant and reassuring. As she slid the key into the lock accepted the key the way a body accepts a breath, naturally gratefully, with a sense of something falling into its proper place after a long absence. Alara turned the key, and the mechanism inside the door moved with a smoothness that bordered on the organic. A series of clicks and whispers and soft metallic sighs that sounded less like a lock being opened and more like a heart being restarted. The door swung inward. The interior of the Shadow was, in every possible way, the opposite of what Alara had braced herself for. She had expected darkness, the kind of oppressive, sentient darkness that haunted the castles of fairy tales, the kind that pressed against the skin and filled the lungs and whispered terrible things in languages that had been dead for centuries. She had expected cold and the smell of decay and the sensation of being watched by things that lived in the walls and under the floors and behind the eyes of portraits that followed you as you walked. What she found was light, warm, golden, enveloping light that spilled from every surface, every window, every fixture, every crack in the ancient walls. The light did not come from candles or lamps or any conventional source. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the stone and the wood and the iron, as though the Shadow were not merely illuminated, but was itself luminous, a structure built not from inert materials, but from something alive, something that had chosen to glow, and warmth. The air inside was warm, not the dry, artificial warmth of a heating system, but the living warmth of a body, a presence, a great breathing thing that had opened its doors and drawn her inside and was now wrapping itself around her like an embrace. Alara felt her muscles, which she had not realized were clenched, begin to relax. She felt her jaw unclench, her shoulders drop, her hands open. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, safe. The foyer of the Shadow was enormous, a cathedral-like space with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow, walls lined with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, and that were filled not sparsely, but densely, with books of every size and color and age, their spines a rainbow of leather and cloth and paper that seemed to pulse with the same gentle light as the walls. The floor was marble, a deep green veined with white, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the light and doubled it, so that standing in the foyer felt like standing inside a jewel. But it was what stood in the center of the foyer that claimed Alara's attention completely. A clock, not just any clock. The clock, her father's clock. The clock he had spent 3 months building. The clock with the brass gears and the painted roses. The clock that had disappeared along with him on a rainy night 11 years ago. It stood on a marble pedestal in the exact center of the foyer, tall and magnificent, and utterly unchanged from the last time she had seen it, its brass gleaming as though it had been polished moments ago. Its face, that beautiful face with the tiny hand-painted roses, glowing with a light that was somehow brighter and warmer than the light of the walls around it. And it was ticking. The sound filled the foyer, a steady, rhythmic tick-tock, tick-tock, that was not merely a mechanical sound, but a narrative one. Each tick a word, each tock a pause, the whole thing a sentence being written in real time, a story being told in the language of gears and springs, and the relentless, beautiful forward motion of time itself. Alara walked toward the clock. She could feel it calling to her, not with words, but with the same warm, pulling sensation she had felt from the key. A gravitational attraction that drew her across the marble floor with the inevitability of a river flowing to the sea. She stopped in front of the pedestal and looked up at the clock's face, and the roses painted there seemed to move, just slightly, their petals shifting in a breeze that did not exist. and she heard or felt or imagined a voice, her father's voice, whispering from somewhere inside the mechanism. There you are, little one. There you are. She pressed her forehead against the cool brass of the clock's casing and closed her eyes and did not cry, because she had done her crying long ago and had emerged from it with a dry, hard shell that she had mistaken for strength, but that she now understood was merely armor. And armor, however necessary, is not the same as strength. Real strength is what it takes to stand in a magical shadow in the middle of an enchanted forest on a rainy night and press your forehead against a clock that your missing father built and let the feeling come, not tears, not yet, but something deeper, something that existed beneath tears, beneath words, beneath the very concept of expression, something that was pure and raw, and that had no name, because no one had ever needed to name it before. She stood there for a long time, her forehead against the clock, the ticking filling her ears and her chest and her blood. And then she opened her eyes and stepped back and looked at the foyer again with new eyes. The bookshelves. She had noticed them before, but she had not truly seen them. Now she saw them, and what she saw took her breath away for the second time that night. The books were not just books. They were stories, literally, actually, manifestly stories. Each book on the shelves was glowing with its own unique light, each one a different color, each one a different intensity. And as Alara looked more closely, she could see that the light was not static, but dynamic, flowing through the pages like blood through veins, pulsing with the rhythm of whatever narrative was contained within. Some of the lights were bright and strong. These, Alara intuitively understood, were stories that were being told, stories that were alive and active, and that were, at this very moment, unfolding somewhere in the world or in the shade, or in the vast liminal space between the two. Other lights were dimmer, barely visible. These were stories that had been told and were now resting, their energy spent, their pages settling into the quiet afterlife of a narrative that had reached its end. And some, a surprising number, were dark, their light extinguished entirely. These were stories that had not yet been told, that were waiting with the patience of seeds in winter for someone to open them and give them voice. Alara reached out and touched the spine of one of the dark books. It was warm under her fingers, warmer than the key had been, and she felt a jolt of something, not electricity, not quite, but a surge of narrative energy, a story trying to tell itself through her touch, pressing against the boundary between the unwritten and the written, like a face pressing against a window. She pulled her hand away, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of responsibility. These were not ordinary books. These were stories in their purest form, not yet contaminated by the compromises of language, not yet reduced to the limitations of words on a page, not yet shaped by the biases and blind spots of whoever might eventually tell them. They were raw, potential, infinite, and they deserved to be treated with reverence. "You understand," said a voice. Ilara turned. He was standing at the far end of the foyer, in the doorway of a corridor that led deeper into the shade down. She had not heard him approach, but then again, in this place, the ordinary rules of sound and space seemed to have been suspended. He was tall, not as tall as the figure who had brought her the key, but tall nonetheless, and broad in a way that suggested not the bulk of muscle, but the density of something more fundamental, as though his body were made of heavier material than the bodies of ordinary men. He was dressed simply dark trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, bare feet on the marble floor, and his hair was dark and fell past his shoulders in a way that was neither careless nor deliberately styled, but simply was the way a river is neither careless nor deliberate, but simply flows. It was his face that held her, not because it was beautiful, although it was, in a certain light, in a certain angle, in a certain fleeting moment when the shadows fell just right, but because it was impossible to read, not in the way that the mask had been impossible to read, with its deliberate obscuration, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. His face was open, unguarded, expressive. She could see the movements of his features as clearly as she could see her own reflection in the marble floor. But the emotions those movements expressed did not correspond to any emotion she recognized. When he looked at her, his brow furrowed and his eyes widened and his lips parted slightly. And these were the movements of a face that was feeling something intensely. But what that something was, Alara could not say. It was like watching a film in a language she did not speak. She could see the actors emoting, could read the body language, could follow the rhythm of the dialogue. But the meaning, the actual content of what was being communicated, remained tantalizingly, maddeningly out of reach. The books, he said, gesturing toward the shelves. You understand what they are. Alara found her voice. They're stories, she said. Stories that haven't been told yet. He nodded slowly. His eyes dark, very dark. The color of the forest outside never left her face. And the ones that are glowing, the stories being told right now, somewhere, and the dim ones, the stories that are finished, at rest. A third expression crossed his face, something that involved a slight tightening of the jaw and a lowering of the eyelids and a very faint intake of breath. And Alara found herself leaning forward, unconsciously, trying to decode it, trying to crack the cipher of this face that communicated in a language she had never learned. You are the first person he said, who has come to this house and understood the books without being told. Your father understood them too. It is why I asked him to stay. The words hit her like a wave. She staggered, actually staggered, her hand shooting out to steady herself against the nearest bookshelf, her fingers brushing the spines of a dozen dark books that flickered at her touch like candles in a draft. My father, she said. You knew my father. You asked him to stay. He's been here. He's been here this whole time. The man's face shifted again. And this time, for just a moment, Alara caught something she recognized. It was in the eyes a flicker, a tremor, a brief fracture in the opacity of his expression, through which she glimpsed, with shocking clarity, an emotion she knew intimately because she had been living with it for 11 years. Grief, raw, old, deep-boned grief. No, he said, not the whole time. Your father was here for 1 year. He was happy here. I believe he was happy here. He told stories the way you do, the way people who understand the books do. He gave voice to narratives that had been waiting in the dark for centuries. He brought light to rooms in this house that had been dark for longer than I can remember. A pause. The unreadable face resettled into its default inscrutability. And then he left. He left, Alara repeated. He chose to leave. He chose to go back to you, the man said. To your mother. He said that there was a story he needed to finish, and that the story was you. You're growing up. You're becoming who you were meant to become. He said he could not tell that story from inside this house, that it was a story that required his absence, not his presence, and that the greatest gift he could give you was the gift of being the one who told it, not the one it was told about. Alara felt the stone in her chest crack again, wider this time, and through the crack she could feel something warm and bright and terrifying trying to get out. That doesn't make sense, she said. He left. He disappeared. He was gone. I needed him, and he was gone, and my mother never recovered from it. She died thinking he had abandoned her. She died. Your mother's story was her own, the man said, and his voice was gentle, impossibly gentle, given the depth of its resonance. As your father's story was his, as your story is yours. This is the thing that the books teach, if you listen to them carefully enough, that every story belongs to the one who is living it, and that no amount of love, however deep, however pure, however desperate, gives anyone the right to enter another person's story and change its ending. Your father knew this. It was why he built the clock. The clock, Alara said, and turned to look at it again, at its painted roses, and its gleaming brass, and its steady narrative ticking. What does the clock do? It keeps time, the man said. Not ordinary time, not the time of clocks and calendars, the time that measures the distance between one moment and the next, but story time, the time inside a narrative, the time that stretches when a character is afraid and compresses when a character is happy and stops entirely when a character is in love. The clock keeps that time. It has been keeping it since before this Shadow was built, since before the forest grew, since before the world learned to tell itself apart from the stories it contains. Alara looked at the clock and felt its ticking in her bones, and she understood, not with her mind, but with some deeper faculty, some organ of perception that she had not known she possessed, that the clock was not merely measuring story time, but creating it. Each tick was a moment being born. Each talk was a moment being released into the world, where it would attach itself to a person or a place or a thing, and become part of whatever story was unfolding there. The clock was the engine of narrative, the heart of the story world, the mechanism by which the raw, formless potential of the dark books was transformed into the living, breathing reality of the glowing ones. My father built this clock, she said, and the words came out as a whisper, because speaking them at full volume felt like it would shatter something fragile and irreplaceable. But you said it's been keeping time since, before the Shadow was built. How could he have built something that existed before he did? The man was quiet for a long time. The clock ticked. The books glowed. The rain fell outside. A constant, gentle presence that Alara could hear through the walls of the Shadow, as though the stone were not solid, but permeable, not a barrier, but a membrane. Your father repaired it, the man said finally. The clock had been broken for a very long time. Centuries. The stories were still being told, but they were tangled, confused, chaotic. Stories that should have been separate were merging. Stories that should have been sequential were happening simultaneously. The world outside this forest was becoming increasingly disordered, not in the way that people perceived disorder, not in the realm of politics or weather or the mundane catastrophes of human life, but in the deeper order, the narrative order, the structure upon which all other structures depend. Your father fixed it. He understood the mechanism in a way that no one had understood it since the clock was first made, and he repaired it. And when he did, the stories resumed their proper flow, and the world, the real world, the world you come from, became, in ways so subtle that no one noticed, more coherent, more meaningful, more like a story that knows where it's going. Alara pressed her palm against the clock again. The brass was warm, alive, vibrating with the energy of a million moments being born and released and born again. She thought of her father's hands, those clever, patient hands, and she imagined them inside this mechanism, adjusting and aligning and coaxing. And she felt a pride so fierce that it burned. But if he fixed it, she said, if the clock is working again, then why am I here? Why did you send for me? The man's face did something extraordinary. It softened. The inscrutability did not disappear. Alara did not think it could disappear. Not entirely. Not for anyone, but it thinned, became more translucent, and through it she could see, as though through a window that had been cleaned for the first time in years, the shape of something vast and tender beneath. Because the clock is breaking again, he said. The words fell into the silence of the foyer like stones into a still pond, and the ripples they created spread outward through the shade, through the books, through the rain, through the night itself. Alara felt the clock's ticking falter, just for a moment. A single skipped beat, a hiccup in the rhythm that had been steady since the moment she entered the Shadow, and then resume, but differently, with a slight irregularity that had not been there before, like a heart that has developed a murmur. A breaking, she said. Slowly, the man said. It has been breaking for several months. The mechanism your father repaired is deteriorating, not because his work was flawed, but because the clock was never meant to run forever without maintenance, and the kind of maintenance it requires can only be performed by someone who understands stories the way your father understood them, who can hear the narrative in a mechanism, who can see the story in a gear. And you think that person is me. I know that person is you. I knew it the moment the figure returned from your bookshop and told me you had taken the key without hesitation. Your father hesitated when he was first brought here. He asked questions. He demanded explanations. He refused to enter the forest until he had been given assurances that no rational person would have found sufficient. But you simply opened the door and walked into the rain. That is not the behavior of someone who needs to be convinced. That is the behavior of someone who has already been convinced, who has been convinced for years, who has been waiting without knowing she was waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. Alara looked at the man. She looked at his impossible face, his unreadable expressions, his dark eyes that held depths she could not fathom. She looked at his simple clothes, his bare feet, his dark hair. She looked at the way the light of the shade fell on his skin and was absorbed rather than reflected, as though his body were made of the same material as the dark books, not dark, not empty, but full of stories that had not yet been told. "What are you?" she asked softly. He looked at her, and for a long time he did not answer. The clock ticked. The rain fell. The books pulsed with their quiet, narrative light. And then he raised one hand and touched his own face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, the bridge of his nose, with a tenderness that made Alara's chest ache. "I am the story that this house tells about itself," he said. "I am the Shaitau's narrative given form. I am what happens when a place accumulates enough stories, enough longing, enough love and grief, and hope and despair, that it can no longer contain them, and they spill out into something that walks and speaks and feels. I am not human, Alara. I have never been human, but I have spent centuries trying to understand what it means to be human. And in all that time, I have learned only one thing with any certainty. What is that? That humans are the only creatures in any world who can take something that is broken and simply by telling a story about it, make it whole again. He lowered his hand. The unreadable face resettled, but the crack remained, that moment of transparency through which Alara had glimpsed the vast, tender thing beneath. And she understood now that the inscrutability was not a mask, not a defense, not a deliberate obscuration. It was simply the natural expression of a being who contained too many stories to be read by any single pair of eyes. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you help me fix the clock?" Alara turned to face the clock. She looked at its painted roses, its brass gears visible through the glass panel in its front, its hands moving with the steady, narrative rhythm that her father had restored. And that was now she could hear, beginning to falter more noticeably, a slight hitch between ticks, a barely perceptible waver in the talks, like a singer whose voice is beginning to fail. She thought of her father. She thought of his hands. She thought of the stories he had told her, the ones about clockwork birds and mechanical horses and gardens made of gears. She thought of the last story he had ever told her, the one about the rain that fell upward and washed away grief. And she understood now that it had not been just a story. It had been a message, a map, a key, not the brass one she held in her hand, but the invisible one she had always carried inside her, the one made of words and memory and love, the one that opened not doors, but hearts, not locks, but stories. Oh yes, she said. The shade out-breathed. She could feel it, a great, slow exhalation that moved through the walls and the floors and the bookshelves and the very air. A release of tension that had been building for months, for years, for centuries. A sigh of relief from a house that had been holding its breath for too long. The books on the shelves flickered, the dark ones flaring briefly with a hint of light, the glowing ones brightening by a degree, the dim ones stirring in their rest like dreamers on the edge of waking. The rain outside changed again, becoming softer, gentler, more like the touch of a hand than the fall of water. The man, the story, the Shaitau's narrative given form, the being who was not human, but who had spent centuries learning what it meant to be, extended his hand to her. His palm was warm, warmer than the key, warmer than the clock, warm the way a home is warm when you return to it after a long journey, warm the way a fire is warm when you have been cold for a very long time. Come, he said. Let me show you the rooms where the stories live. Let me show you the garden where the dark books bloom. Let me show you the library where your father sat and told tales that made the stars burn brighter And then, when you have seen everything, when you understand the mechanism and the narrative and the shape of what needs to be repaired, we will sit together in the rain, because it is always raining here in the story world, because rain is the sky's way of telling a story about the earth, and the earth's way of listening. And we will fix the clock, and the stories will flow again, and the world outside this forest will become once more coherent and meaningful and whole. Elira took his hand. His skin was warm, and beneath the warmth she could feel the pulse of 1,000 narratives, 1,000,000 stories, an infinity of words unspoken and tales untold, all of them moving through him the way blood moves through a body, the way sap moves through a tree, the way rain moves through the sky, not as separate, discrete things, but as a single, continuous, unbroken flow that connected everything to everything else and proved in its very existence that the world was not a collection of isolated objects, but a story, one vast and beautiful and never-ending story, and that she, Elira Larach, daughter of Marcel, keeper of a bookshop, teller of tales, woman who had walked into the rain because the rain had asked her to, was not merely a character in that story, but its teller, its voice, its breath. She walked with him through the Shaddow, and the Shaddow opened itself to her like a book, room after room after room, each one a chapter, each one a world, each one a story waiting to be told. The first room was the library of lost stories, a vast circular space with a domed ceiling painted with constellations that were not the constellations of any known sky. The shelves here held books that were not dark and not glowing, but something in between, a faint, ghostly luminescence, like the light of a star that has died, but whose image still reaches the earth, traveling across the void long after its source has been extinguished. These were stories that had been told once, long ago, and then forgotten, not because they were unworthy of remembering, but because the world had changed around them, had moved on, had developed new tastes and new concerns and new narratives that crowded out the old ones like invasive species in a garden. But here, in this library, they lingered, their light fading, but not yet gone, sustained by the Shatow's memory of the time when they had been bright and strong and alive. Alara ran her fingers along the spines as she walked, and with each touch she received a flash, a fragment, a whisper, a half-remembered dream of the story inside. A woman who wove cloth from moonlight, a child who could speak to rivers, a city that existed only on Tuesdays, a love affair between a mountain and the wind. They were beautiful, these fragments, achingly beautiful, and each one carried with it a sense of loss so profound that Alara felt tears stinging her eyes. Tears not for any individual story, but for the sheer, staggering number of stories that had been told and forgotten. Stories that had been born and lived and died without leaving any trace except this faint, dying glow on a shelf in a magical library in an impossible shade in the heart of an enchanted forest. These stories can be reborn, the man said, as though reading her thoughts. If someone tells them again, if someone gives them new breath, the light is not gone. It is merely waiting. Like the dark books, they need only a voice. The second room was the garden of unwritten tales, and it was impossibly a garden, an indoor garden occupying a space that could not possibly have fit inside the shade house walls. A vast, open-air expanse of grass and flowers and trees and water that existed in defiance of architecture, physics, and common sense. The sky above was the same star-scattered sky she had seen from the clearing, and the rain fell here too, but gently, misting down onto the garden like a fine veil. And where each raindrop landed, something grew, not instantly, not with the dramatic speed of magic in a children's story, but with the patient, steady growth of a narrative being told. A sprout emerging from the soil, a bud forming on a branch, a flower opening its petals to the rain and the starlight and the warm golden light that emanated from the earth itself. Each plant in the garden was a story. Alara could see it in the way they grew, not randomly, not according to the patterns of botany, but according to the patterns of narrative. The roses grew in spirals, their petals unfurling like plot twists. The ivy climbed the walls of the garden in branching patterns that looked like family trees. The oak trees rose from the ground with the slow, deliberate packing of a long novel, their trunks thick and steady, and their branches reaching outward in every direction like the themes of a story that refuses to be contained. And everywhere, in every corner of the garden, there were flowers she did not recognize, strange, hybrid blooms that combined the features of multiple species, as though different stories had been grafted together, their roots intertwining beneath the soil, their petals sharing colors and scents and shapes in a riot of narrative cross-pollination. The dark books grow here, the man said. Every story that has not yet been told puts down roots in this garden and grows toward the light, waiting for someone to pick it and open it and read it aloud. Your father spent hours in this garden. He said it was the only place he had ever been where he could hear the stories growing. A sound like whispering, he said, like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once in a language that was not quite any language, but that he could understand perfectly. Alara knelt in the wet grass and pressed her ear to the ground, and she heard it, the whispering, 1,000 voices, 10,000, 100,000, all speaking at once in that language that was not a language, and she understood it. She understood it perfectly, because it was not a language of words, but a language of feelings. of images, of the raw, unshaped material from which all stories were made. The fear of the dark, the joy of reunion, the ache of loss, the thrill of discovery, the quiet peace of a room at the end of a long day, the wild, chaotic beauty of a heart that has just fallen in love. It was the vocabulary of human experience, and it was speaking to her, and she was speaking back to it without words, without sound, in the way that roots speak to soil and rain speaks to sky, and stories speak to the ones who are meant to tell them. The third room was the room of stories being told, and it was the most extraordinary of all. It was a long, high gallery lined not with bookshelves, but with windows, and each window looked out onto a different scene. Through one window, Alara saw a young woman standing in a kitchen, crying over a letter she had just received. Through another, she saw an old man sitting on a dock, fishing, his face serene in the late afternoon light. Through another, she saw two children chasing each other through a field of sunflowers, their laughter drifting up toward a sky that was impossibly blue. Through another, she saw a city at night, its lights blazing, its streets crowded with people who were each, in their own way, living a story that was visible from this window, but invisible to everyone else. These were the glowing books given form. These were the stories being told right now, at this very moment, somewhere in the world. Each window was a narrative in progress, a life being lived, a tale being spun, and the light that filled the room, that warm, golden narrative light, was the combined radiance of all of them. All these stories being told simultaneously, all these lives being lived in parallel, all these threads weaving together into the vast, incomprehensible tapestry of human experience. Alara moved from window to window, her breath catching at each one. She saw birth and death, love and loss, joy and sorrow, the extraordinary and the mundane, all of it equally luminous, equally worthy of the light that streamed from each scene like gold from a furnace. She saw a man building a house. She saw a woman learning to walk again after an accident. She saw a teenager sitting alone in a bedroom, writing in a journal. She saw a grandmother holding a newborn. She saw a dog chasing a ball. She saw a sunset over an ocean. She saw a candle being lit in a dark room. She saw a hand reaching for another hand across a table, and she understood with a clarity that felt like the clearing of fog from a window that every one of these moments was a story, not just the dramatic ones, not just the ones that would be written down or remembered or passed from generation to generation, but all of them, every moment, every breath, every heartbeat, every tiny, insignificant, infinitely precious instant of being alive. The clock did not just keep time for the grand narratives, the epics, and the tragedies, and the love stories that filled the books on the foyer shelves. It kept time for all of it, for everything, for the story of a raindrop falling on a window in a small bookshop on a Thursday evening, for the story of a woman pressing her palm against cold glass and feeling the vibration of the sky, for the story of a key being held in a hand and a door being opened and a forest being entered and a truth being discovered that changed everything. The clock kept time for her story, and her story, she realized, was not the story of a woman who had lost her father. That was a chapter, an important chapter, a formative chapter, a chapter that had shaped everything that came after it. But it was not the whole story. The whole story was bigger, wider, deeper, more complex, and more beautiful than any single chapter could contain. The whole story was the story of a woman who loved books, and loved rain, and loved stories, and who had spent her life, without knowing it, preparing for this moment when she would stand in a room full of windows and see the world as it truly was, not a collection of separate, isolated lives, but a single, continuous narrative, a story so vast and so intricate that no single mind could comprehend it entirely, but that could be felt, could be touched, could be loved, one window at a time. She turned from the windows and looked at the man. He was standing in the center of the gallery, his face illuminated by the light of 1,000 stories. And in that light, for the first time, she could read him. Not completely. There were still depths she could not fathom, still rooms in his inner architecture that were closed to her, but enough to see that the expression on his face was not inscrutable, but overwhelmed. He was overwhelmed by the stories. He had been living inside them for centuries, surrounded by them, sustained by them, and they had not diminished him, but had instead expanded him, filled him, made him into something so vast and so complex that no single expression could contain what he felt. He was not unreadable. He was too readable. Every emotion he had ever experienced was written on his face simultaneously, layered on top of each other like pages in a book. And the reason she could not parse his expression was not that it was blank, but that it was too full. "What is your name?" she asked. He looked at her, and the layers of expression shifted, rearranged, and settled into something that she could read clearly, unmistakably, with no ambiguity at all. It was hope. "I have not had a name," he said, "for a very long time. Names are given by those who love you, and no one has loved me, not in the way that nomming requires, since the last storyteller left this house. Your father gave me a name once. He called me a pause." The hope on his face flickered, not dying but deepening, becoming more serious, more weighted with the gravity of what was being offered. "He called me Beau. Beau, beautiful. The name that the world had given to the beast in the oldest version of the oldest story. The story about a creature who was not a creature, but a person. A person who was not ugly, but simply unseen, misunderstood, unread. A person whose face was not a mask, but a book written in a language that no one had taken the time to learn. Bo, Elara said, and the name felt right in her mouth, felt like a key turning in a lock, felt like a story finding its voice after years of silence. My father called you Bo. Yes. Then you want me to call you that too. I want, he said slowly, carefully, each word chosen with the precision of a clockmaker selecting a gear. Whatever you are willing to give. I have learned in my centuries of watching stories unfold that wanting more than someone is willing to give is the beginning of every tragedy. I do not wish to be a tragedy, Elara. I wish to be a story, your story. If you will have me and stories, the good ones, the ones that endure, are built on what is freely given, not what is taken. Elara looked at him, at Bo, at the Shaydow's narrative given form, at the being who was not human, but who understood humanity better than most humans did. And she felt something move inside her that she had not felt in a very long time. Not love, not yet. Love was too big a word, too final a word that belonged at the end of a story, not in the middle, but something that might, with time and care and the patient nurturing that all good stories require, grow into love, the beginning of a beginning, the first page of a new chapter. Show me the clock's mechanism, she said. Show me what's broken, and then we'll fix it together. He nodded, and the hope on his face bloomed like one of the garden's impossible flowers. And he led her deeper into the Shaydow, deeper into the story, and the rain followed them like a faithful companion, falling softly, steadily, ceaselessly, the sky telling its story to the earth, and the earth, at last, after so long listening, the clock's mechanism was housed in a room at the very heart of the Shaydow, a room that was not a room but a space, a void, a cavity in the architecture of reality that existed not inside the Shaydow, but beneath it, around it, woven through it like a nervous system through a body. To reach it, Bo led her down a spiral staircase that descended not just through the shade house foundations, but through layers of story itself, each step taking them deeper into the narrative substratum that underpinned the world she knew. The walls of the staircase were not stone, but text, words, sentences, paragraphs, whole chapters of stories that flowed past them as they descended, written in a script that was at once familiar and utterly alien, a script that Alara could read not with her eyes, but with her heart, each word resonating in her chest like a note of music. She read fragments as they passed. Once upon a time, there was a woman who lived in a house made of rain. The knight entered the forest knowing that he would not come out, and he was at peace with this. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, a universe was born. She opened the door and found not a room, but a memory. Not a memory, but a dream. Not a dream, but a truth that had been waiting for her since before she was born. The stories swirled around her, through her, into her, and she absorbed them the way the earth absorbs rain, not passively, but hungrily, gratefully. Each one a nourishment she had not known she needed. At the bottom of the staircase was a door. Not the massive, carved door of the shade house entrance, but a small, simple door of plain wood with a plain iron handle and no lock at all. It was, Alara thought, the most unremarkable door she had ever seen, and yet it filled her with a sense of awe that the grandest architecture could not have produced, because she understood, without being told, that this door was the boundary between the stories and the thing that made the stories possible, the threshold between the tale and the teller, the word and the breath that gives it voice. Spo opened the door. The room beyond was round and domed and vast, and it was filled with gears, not the small, precise gears of a watch or a clock, but enormous, magnificent gears, gears as tall as houses, gears wider than the bookshop where Alara had spent her adult life, gears of brass and iron and copper, and substances she could not name, all of them interlocking and turning and clicking and whirring in a symphony of mechanical motion that was so beautiful, so perfectly coordinated, so breathtakingly complex that Alara could only stand in the doorway and stare. The gears filled the room from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, a three-dimensional lattice of metal and motion that extended in every direction, some gears turning clockwise and some counterclockwise, some moving fast and some moving slow, some so large that their teeth moved with the majestic deliberation of continents drifting, and some so small that they were little more than bright points of light spinning in the spaces between their larger cousins. The sound was overwhelming, not loud exactly, but deep, a bass thrum that vibrated in Alara's bones and in the marrow of those bones and in the atoms that made up that marrow, a sound that was less a sound and more a sensation, the sensation of being inside something alive, and at the center of it all, suspended in the nexus, where 1,000 gears met and meshed and transferred their motion from one to the next in an unbroken chain of causality, was a heart, not a metaphorical heart, not a symbolic heart, an actual heart, a thing of flesh and blood and muscle, roughly the size of a human fist, suspended in a cage of delicate golden filigree that held it in place without constraining it. It beat with a steady, powerful rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock above, and with each beat, a pulse of golden light radiated outward through the gears, traveling along the teeth and the shafts and the bearings like a signal moving along a network. And as the light passed, each gear it touched glowed briefly with the same warm, golden radiance that filled the shade house rooms gears. The heart was the clock. The clock was the heart. They were the same thing, not two things connected, but one thing expressed in two different languages. The language of biology and the language of mechanism. The language of stories and the language of time. And the heart was wounded. Elara could see it now, the source of the clock's faltering rhythm. A crack ran through the left ventricle. A thin, dark line that pulsed with each beat, spreading incrementally like a crack in ice, like a fissure in stone, like the first fracture in a story that is about to break apart. With each beat of the heart, golden light leaked from the crack. Not much, just a trickle, a thin stream of luminescence that was absorbed by the surrounding gears and dissipated, lost, wasted. But over time, over the months that the crack had been growing, the cumulative loss had been enormous. The heart was still beating, still pumping, still generating the light that sustained the stories, but it was doing so at a fraction of its full capacity, and the fraction was shrinking. That is why the stories are beginning to tangle, Bo said. He was standing beside her, and she could feel the vibration of the gears in his body, could see the golden light playing across his skin, could understand now that he was not merely connected to this mechanism, but was a part of it, another expression of the same central truth, another language telling the same story. The heart generates the narrative energy that keeps the stories flowing in their proper channels. When the energy diminishes, the channels weaken and the stories begin to bleed into each other. Given enough time, years, decades, centuries, the heart will fail entirely. The gears will stop, and the stories will collapse into a single, undifferentiated mass of narrative noise. No beginnings, no middles, no ends. No characters, no plots, no meaning. Just sound. The sound of a million voices all screaming at once. Elara stepped into the room. The gears moved around her, over her, under her, cathedral of machinery that was also a cathedral of story. And she walked toward the heart with the slow, reverent steps of a pilgrim approaching an altar. The air was warm here, warmer than anywhere else in the chateau, warmer than the garden, warmer than the rain, and it smelled of something she could not identify, but that she recognized on a level deeper than scent. It smelled like the moment before a story begins, that breathless, electric instant when the teller opens their mouth and the listener leans forward and anything is possible. As she reached the heart, up close, the crack was more frightening than she had anticipated, not because of its size, but because of what she could feel emanating from it. Not pain exactly, not sorrow, something more fundamental than either. The crack was leaking not just light, but narrative, raw, unshaped, chaotic narrative that poured out of the wound like blood from an injury. And as it passed through the gears, it distorted them, bent them, caused them to skip and stutter, and produce dissonant harmonics that Alara could hear as a faint, high-pitched whine beneath the deeper thrum of the mechanism. What caused the crack? She asked. Bo was behind her, close, but not touching, his presence a warmth at her back like a second sun. Grief, he said. The heart is not a machine, Alara. It is a heart, and hearts break when they lose what they love. What did it lose? Your father. The words settled over the room like a fall of snow. The gears continued to turn. The heart continued to beat. The light continued to pulse. But everything seemed quieter now, more delicate, as though the mechanism itself were holding its breath. When your father left, Bo said, the heart broke. Not completely. It was strong enough to keep beating, to keep the stories flowing, to keep the world outside this forest coherent and meaningful. But the crack formed in that moment, and it has been growing ever since. I have tried to repair it. I have tried everything I know, every technique, every mechanism, every spell and ritual and narrative trick that centuries of accumulated knowledge have provided me. But I cannot fix a heart, Alara. I am made of stories, not feelings. I can manipulate narrative, but I cannot create emotion. And the heart does not run on gears or springs or brass. It runs on feeling. It runs on love. It runs on the very thing that I, by my nature, cannot produce. Alara looked at the crack. She looked at the golden light leaking from it. She thought about her father and about grief and about the way love and loss are not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. The way the depth of your grief is always exactly equal to the depth of your love. The way a heart that has been broken by loss is a heart that has been proven beyond any doubt to be capable of love. Then I'll fix it, she said. Said how? The same way my father fixed the clock, by understanding it, by listening to it, by finding the story inside the mechanism and telling it back to health. She raised her hands and placed them on the heart. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was like touching every story ever told simultaneously. She felt the joy of reunions and the sorrow of partings and the terror of dark nights and the peace of quiet mornings and the wild, reckless abandon of falling in love and the steady, faithful endurance of staying in love and the sharp, bright pain of loss and the slow, gentle healing of time and a million other things, a billion other things, an infinity of other things, all of them moving through her at once, all of them demanding her attention, all of them needing to be felt and acknowledged and held. She could feel the crack. It was a wound in the narrative fabric of the heart, a place where the story had been interrupted, cut off mid-sentence, left dangling like an unresolved chord, and she could feel what had caused it. Not just her father's departure, but the nature of that departure. The way he had left not in anger or despair, but in love. The way he had walked out of the shadow and into the rain and back to his daughter, because he loved her more than he loved this place, more than he loved the stories, more than he loved the magic, and the heart, which was, after all, a heart, had felt that love and had broken under the weight of it, because love, when it is pure and complete and given freely, is the most powerful force in any world. And power, even the power of love, can break things. Alara closed her eyes. She let the stories flow through her. She did not try to organize them, or categorize them, or make sense of them. She simply let them be, let them move, let them exist in all their chaotic, contradictory, beautiful complexity. And then, slowly, gently, with the same care her father had used when handling the most delicate of clock mechanisms, she began to tell a story, not a specific story, not a story with characters and a plot and a beginning and an end, but the story, the meta-story, the story, the narrative that contained all other narratives, the tale that was being told every time anyone, anywhere told any tale about anything at all. She told the story of storytelling itself. She told it with her hands on the heart and her breath in the warm air of the mechanism room, and her mind open wider than it had ever been open before. She told it not in words, but in feelings, not in sentences, but in sensations, not in the language of the tongue, but in the language of the blood. She told the story of the first story ever told, the story of the first person who ever looked at the world and felt something about it and needed, with a desperation that was indistinguishable from hunger, to share that feeling with another person. She told the story of the first listener, the first person who ever sat still and quiet and received another person's experience as a gift. She told the story of the space between teller and listener, that sacred liminal space where the story lives, where it is neither the tellers nor the listeners, but belongs to both and neither. A shared dream, a collective reverie, a miracle of empathy that is, when you think about it, the most extraordinary thing human beings have ever done. She told the story of stories growing and changing and evolving, spreading from mouth to mouth, and campfire to campfire, and generation to generation, accumulating details like a river accumulates sediment, changing course like a river changes course, carving new channels through the landscape of human consciousness, like a river carves new channels through stone. She told the story of stories being written down, fixed in ink on paper, made permanent and portable and reproducible. And she told the story of what was lost in that process, the spontaneity, the immediacy, the living, breathing presence of a teller whose face and hands and voice were as much a part of the story as the words themselves. She told the story of stories being printed and distributed and mass-produced. And she told the story of what was gained: accessibility, democratization, the radical idea that stories belonged not to the elite, but to everyone, that the right to tell and to listen was a human right, not a privilege. She told the story of stories being forgotten, and she told the story of stories being remembered. She told the story of a father who built a clock that kept story time. And she told the story of a daughter who walked into the rain to find him. And she told the story of a shade dao that was made of stories. And she told the story of a being who was not human, but who loved like a human, grieved like a human, hoped like a human, and who was waiting, had been waiting for centuries, for someone to see him not as a beast, but as a story, a beautiful, complex, infinite story that deserved to be told. And as she told, the crack began to close, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, gently, the way way a wound heals when it is properly tended, the way a story resolves when it is properly told. The dark line that had split the heart's left ventricle began to narrow, the edges drawing together like the lips of a cut closing under a bandage, and the golden light that had been leaking from the wound began to diminish, not because the heart was producing less light, but because the light was being contained again, held within the vessel that was meant to hold it, channeled through the gears in the steady, coherent streams that kept the stories flowing in their proper courses. Alara felt the change in the mechanism around her. The dissonant whine that had underlain the gear's thrum began to fade. The gears themselves began to move more smoothly, more precisely, their teeth meshing with a cleanliness that produced not just motion, but music, a deep, harmonic hum that was not one note, but all notes, not one melody, but all melodies, the sound of every story ever told being told simultaneously in perfect harmony. She poured more of herself into the telling. She gave the heart not just her understanding of stories, but her experience of them. The stories she had told herself about the people in her bookshop, the stories she had made up as a child, the stories her father had told her at bedtime, the stories she had found in books, and the stories she had found in silences, and the stories she had found in rain. She gave it her grief, the grief for her father, the grief for her mother, the grief for the life she might have had if the story had been different. She gave it her love, the love for her father, the love for her mother, the love for books and rain and stories, and the quiet, sacred space between a teller and a listener. She gave it everything she had, everything she was, holding nothing back, because she understood now that this was what stories asked of you. Not your words, not your skill, not your technique, but yourself, your whole self, given freely and without reservation, and the heart receiving her gift healed. The crack closed, gears sang, and in the golden radiance that filled the mechanism room, Alara felt something she had not felt in 11 years, her father's presence. Not his ghost, not his memory, but his presence, real and warm and tangible, as though he were standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, the way he used to stand beside her when she was a child, watching her learn to read, watching the words unlock themselves for her one by one, watching the stories enter her eyes and take root in her heart. "There you are, little one," the presence said. "There you are." She opened her eyes. The heart was whole. It pulsed with a light so bright and so warm that she had to squint, and the golden filigree that held it glowed like molten sun, and the gears around it turned with a precision and a beauty that made her want to weep with the sheer, overwhelming rightness of it. The mechanism was not just repaired. It was renewed, reborn, restored to a state that was better than it had been before the crack, because the repair had not simply patched the wound, but had strengthened the tissue around it, the way a broken bone, when it heals, becomes thicker and stronger at the site of the fracture. She turned to Beau. He was standing exactly where she had left him, but he was different. The golden light was streaming through him now, moving through his body the way it moved through the gears. And as it passed, it illuminated him from within, and she could see, finally, fully, completely, what he was. He was beautiful, not in the conventional sense, not in the way that magazines and movies defined beauty, but in the way that a story is beautiful. Because of its complexity, its depth, its willingness to contain contradiction and ambiguity, and the full, unfiltered range of human experience. His face in the golden light was not unreadable, but infinitely readable. Every emotion he had ever felt written on it simultaneously, like a palimpsest. And the overall effect was not confusion, but richness, a face that contained multitudes, a face that you could look at for 1,000 years and still find new things to see. The rain was falling through the ceiling of the mechanism room, not as a leak, but as a feature, as though the Shadow had decided that this room, of all rooms, should be open to the sky. It fell on the gears, and on the heart, and on Bo, and on Alara, and where it touched the golden light, it scattered into 1,000 tiny rainbows, and the rainbows moved through the mechanism like stories moving through the world, bright and brief and beautiful. "Thank you," Bo said, and his voice was different now, clearer, simpler, less layered, as though the healing of the heart had healed something in him as well. "Thank you for telling the story." Alara looked at him. Water dripped from her hair and ran down her face and fell from her eyelashes like the tears she had not allowed herself to shed for 11 years. She was soaked to the skin, standing in the heart of an impossible machine, in the depths of an impossible shadow, in the middle of an impossible forest. And she had never felt more real, more present, more fully herself. "I didn't tell the story," she said. "I just let it tell itself through me." Bo smiled. It was the first smile she had seen on his face, and it was extraordinary, not a simple expression, but a complex one, containing joy and relief and gratitude and something else, something newer, something that was just beginning to form, like a bud on one of the garden's impossible flowers, not yet open, but undeniably present, undeniably alive. "That," he said, "is what all the best storytellers say." He reached for her hand. She gave it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and trembling slightly, and the golden light pulsed through their joined hands, and the gears sang, and the rain fell, and somewhere in the shadow above them, a book that had been dark for a very long time began, very faintly, to glow. They climbed the spiral staircase together, hand the stories flowed past them on the walls, and Alara read them as she climbed, not fragments this time, but whole narratives, complete and coherent and beautiful, stories that had been waiting in the dark and were now, because the heart was whole and the mechanism was restored, and the narrative energy was flowing at full strength, beginning to find their way into the light. She read a story about a clockmaker who fell in love with a house. She read a story about a house that fell in love with a storyteller. She read a story about a storyteller who fell in love with the rain. She read a story about the rain, which loved everyone equally and asked nothing in return, and which fell, as it always had and always would, on the just and the unjust, on the beautiful and the beastly, on the lost and the found, with the same gentle, patient, inexorable persistence. Because the rain, like a good story, knows that the deepest truths are not learned in a single downpour, but absorbed over a lifetime of storms. They emerged from the staircase into the foyer. The clock above them was ticking with a new steadiness, a new confidence, its rhythm as reliable as a heartbeat, as regular as breathing, as inevitable as the turning of the earth. The books on the shelves were brighter now, not just the glowing ones, but the dim ones, and even the dark ones, which were beginning to stir, to flicker, to show the first tentative signs of the light that was, at last, finding its way to them. Through the Shatow's windows, Alara could see the forest. The bois de Sambre was no longer dark and intimidating, or rather, it was still dark, still ancient, still vast beyond comprehension. But the darkness no longer felt hostile. It felt nurturing. It felt like the darkness of soil, of a womb, of the space between the stars where new worlds are born. The rain was falling through the trees, and where it touched the canopy, it caught the faint, filtering light of whatever sky existed above this place, and scattered it into a million tiny jewels that hung from the leaves like the world's most delicate chandelier. "Will you stay?" Bo asked. Elara looked at the chateau, at its warm walls and its glowing books, and its impossible garden and its windows that looked out onto every story being told in the world. She looked at the clock, her father's clock, ticking steadily in the center of the foyer, keeping time for every narrative that had ever been or ever would be. She looked at Bo, at his beautiful, impossible, infinitely readable face, at his dark eyes that held the depth of every story ever told, at his hand still holding hers with a gentleness that was itself a kind of story. A story about two people who had found each other in the rain and had chosen, for reasons that neither of them fully understood, to hold on. She thought about her bookshop, her small, warm, safe bookshop on Rue de Ville, with its familiar shelves and its comfortable chair and its burgundy curtains that still smelled of her mother's lavender. She thought about her apartment 3 blocks away, with its chamomile tea and its nightstand books and its bed that was too big for one person. She thought about her life, the life she had built in the absence of her father, a life that was good and quiet and meaningful in its own small way. But that had always, she now understood, been a prologue, a first chapter, the beginning of a story that was much larger and stranger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. She could go back. The key would take her. She could walk out of the chateau, through the forest, back to the town, back to the bookshop, back to the life she knew. She could close the door behind her and never return, and the chateau would remain, and the clock would tick, and the stories would flow, and she would spend the rest of her days selling books to strangers and telling herself stories in the quiet hours of the night, and wondering always what might have been. Or she could stay. She could stay and tend the garden of unwritten tailies. She could stay and bring light to the library of lost stories. She could stay and watch through the windows of the room of stories being told, the vast, unfolding tapestry of human experience in all its radiant, heartbreaking, incomprehensible beauty. She could stay and sit with Beau in the rain, because it was always raining here in the story world, and she loved the rain, had always loved the rain, and to live in a place where the rain never stopped was not a curse, but a gift. The kind of gift that the universe gives only to those who have proven, through years of quiet, faithful attention, that they are worthy of receiving it. She could stay and be a storyteller, not the kind who tells stories to herself in an empty bookshop, but the kind who tells stories to the Shadow itself, who gives voice to the dark books, who brings light to the rooms that have been dark for too long, who keeps the heart beating strong and true and steady by doing the one thing that hearts have always needed, telling them that they are loved, that they are seen, that the stories they contain are worth telling. "I'll stay," she said. Beau's face did something that she had never seen it do before. It became simple. The layers of accumulated emotion, the centuries of stories written on his features, the overwhelming complexity of a being who contained too many narratives to be easily read, all of it faded, not disappearing entirely, but receding like a tide going out, leaving behind a single, clear, unmistakable expression. At peace, he looked peaceful. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, and his lips were warm, and the kiss was a story, a brief one, a small one, a story about gratitude and wonder, and the beginning of something that neither of them could name yet, but that both of them knew with the certainty of a clock's ticking would be worth telling. The rain fell, the clock ticked, the stories flowed, and in a chateau at the heart of an enchanted forest, in a world that existed in the space between the told and the untold, mechanism that turned human experience into the golden light of narrative. A woman who had walked into the rain, and a being who was made of stories sat together on the marble floor of the foyer, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined, and they listened to the clock, and the clock told them a story. It told them a story about a father and a daughter, about a clockmaker and a storyteller, about a loss and a finding, about a beast who was not a beast, but a love that had not yet been recognized as love, and about a beauty who was not a beauty, but a soul that had learned through years of quiet courage to see the narrative in everything, in the rain on a window, in the warmth of a key, in the face of a being who had been waiting for her longer than she had been alive. It told them a story about stories, about how they are not escapes from reality, but entrances into it, about how they are not lies, but deeper truths, about how the act of telling a story, any story, from the simplest fairy tale to the most complex epic, is an act of love, an act of connection, an act of reaching across the void between one consciousness and another, and saying, with whatever words you have available, I am here. You are not alone. This is what it feels like to be alive. The rain continued to fall. It fell on the shade down, and on the forest, and on the town beyond the forest, on the bookshop with its burgundy curtains and its poetry section, and its window where a woman had once pressed her palm and felt the vibration of the sky. It fell on the streets and the rooftops and the old wrought iron bench where Jacques the homeless man slept.